Hi. MIDI is an analog monosynth inspired by both East and West Coast synthesis techniques. And I'll explain what that means in a bit. It's a knob per function synth. There's no shift key or hidden features. It makes sounds many analog synths can't. Its build is excellent and it has the price to match. It's got a small but mighty patch bay in the back. I can expand it quite a bit, as we'll see in this video. So the question is it worth it? In this video, I'll take a look at what it can do, including pros and cons, and let you decide. I'll add extended jams with MIDI at the end of this video and post additional content on my Patreon. Before I start, a quick disclosure. Majella Audio, or Majella in Dutch, sent MIDI over for a review and it cost me substantially less than retail, but as always they have no say over the content of this video. This channel is funded by viewers who subscribe to my content and book updates on Patreon, YouTube Premium and ads, and price check affiliate links in the description which help the channel regardless of the product you choose to buy. Okay, I'll start with an overview. First, a word about the build. MIDI makes a very good first impression. The fit and finish have a premium feel. The knobs and switches feel sturdy. And the LED rings around the harmonics and folder knobs aren't just there for show. They give you visual feedback as to the mod status of these parameters. In the box is a printed manual, which is always appreciated, and the synth doesn't require a wall wart. However, it doesn't come with a power cable, and it also doesn't come with any patch cables for the patch bay in the back, so you'll need to buy patch cables to use it. Since the patch bay is in the back and you can't see it, I printed this little legend to help me out so I don't forget what's available. Let's continue with the overview. On the left half, or the West Coast, IMPLEXUS has two oscillators with octave and waveform control for both, and a wave folder and sub-oscillator for the complex oscillator. Then there's global pitch control for both oscillators, or generators as they're called here. And then on the right side, East Coast in this analogy, is the mixer for the two oscillators and the sub-oscillator, a 12 dB per octave low and high pass filter with an envelope generator connected to the mod envelope. This single mod depth envelope is a testament to how the focus is really on the oscillators, which have multiple mod sources connected to them with dedicated knobs. Then you've got a stereo delay unit, the single chain up until the delay is in mono, and you can mix the delay in with the analog signal path. Then you've got two LFOs. The LFOs and the delay can be tempo synced to a master clock, which you can either tap tempo, sync to MIDI, or to external clock. Many synths have a tempo sync toggle for the LFOs or the delays. The interesting choice here is to give each time division its own button. Then you've got two ADSR envelopes, an amp envelope which can be droned, and a mod envelope which can be looped. The attack decay stage can be looped. Both envelopes have velocity control. On the back are a USB type B jack for MIDI, not audio, full-size MIDI in and through, and 1/4-inch headphone jacks, and then balanced left and right outputs. Make sure to use balanced, meaning TRS cables for this, because the TS cables can damage the synth, and I also heard oscillator bleed when trying TS cables before I knew you should use TRS cables. Like I mentioned earlier, also on the back is the patch bay with 4 outputs and 8 inputs. Let's take a deeper look at MIDI. A significant part of its interface is the complex generator, the name being a nod to Don Buchla's synths. The main idea behind an oscillator like this is that you start with a relatively simple waveform with a relatively small number of harmonics, and then you add harmonics using a wave folder and you can change the base waveform from a sort of square or slightly rounded square, and then morph through something that looks like a sine to something that looks like a sawtooth, and fold it beyond comprehension. And that obviously impacts the result of what gets wavefolded. This, as opposed to East Coast synthesis, if I lower the level of the complex generator and increase the level of the basic generator and bring out the familiar sawtooth. With, quote, East Coast synthesis, you start with a harmonically rich oscillator and you remove harmonics by filtering them out. And the two result in obviously distinctively and very different sounds. The basic shapes or harmonics on the complex oscillator don't look as sharp. So this is its sawtooth. Doesn't look as sharp as the basic generator, but that's a good thing because sharp edges don't fold well, as well, at least, as rounded edges. And let's say if you go to a bit more basic shape, the wave folder also has a bias function, which causes asymmetrical folding and clipping to the main complex generator or oscillator. The result is even more harmonics and a different timbre to the sound. So those are the raw waveforms and folders of the complex generator. It has a sub-oscillator, square wave, and then we already mentioned the basic generator or oscillator. It has three simple shapes that don't morph. Notably interesting for the complex generator is the sheer number of mod sources that it has. So you have direct control for the envelope amount, the mod envelope amount, to the harmonics, as well as a mod amount for LFO1. And then if we tame these for a bit, envelope amount for the folder. You have control over LFO amounts into both the folder and bias, and you can choose which LFO goes into which. And the interplay between two LFOs sent to two destinations, set to two different time divisions, can result in pretty interesting patches, and changing the time division obviously dramatically changes the patch. And then if that wasn't enough, you've got audio rate cross mods from the basic generator to the folder, the bias, and the overall complex generator FM. So this is what audio rate modulation sounds like into bias, and that almost sounds digital. And the waveform you choose for this cross mod is important as well. Then you've got the same thing, audio rate modulation for the folder. Nice, interesting, beauty sounds. And then good old simple linear FM. As per any oscillator cross mod, the frequency of the modulating oscillator in relation to the destination oscillator matters, especially whether they're in a harmonic relationship or not. Certainly worth experimenting with, though there is no way to modulate the FM mod depth if you wanted to bring this in or out with an envelope or LFO. Modulation and effects are really important, I think, with synths like these to keep these harsh harmonics flowing in and out. The delay comes in quite handy for this, and obviously the synth pairs well with the reverb as well. Continuing our look at modulation, the LFOs are relatively simple. Ramp up. There's a sine wave. There's no triangle, but I don't think that's a big deal. Ramp down, sawtooth. Square. And random, or sample and hold. A useful way to add randomness and variety to a patch. The LFO shapes don't morph, but you can sort of get away with something similar if you loop the mod envelope. And you can create your own LFO shapes. This is an analog envelope which goes well into audio rates when it loops. There's actually another little LFO here for vibrato that works independently of the two LFOs. And LFO2 does have an output on the patch bay, so you can patch it in to any of the destinations. More on that in the patch ideas section of this video. So that's modulation. Let's talk about the filter. You can use it to filter harsh harmonics, and it has a high pass mode as well. Let's listen to it on a sawtooth. It's a 12 dB per octave filter. It doesn't close all the way, by the way. If that's important to you, say, to make a low-pass gate style envelope with it. Resonance doesn't impact the lows, which is a good thing. Sounds nice. Doesn't self-oscillate. That's as high as it goes. There's no filter tracking, there's no direct connection from any of the LFOs to the filter unless you use the patch bay, but you do get control over the mod envelope depth. And yeah, the filter sounds nice. It sort of has a nice sparkly Roland style vibe to it. Let's try it without resonance. I asked the company about why so few mod sources to the filter, and they said the focus was on the complex generator and this was just to tame harmonics, but I think the filter is pretty nice. Anyway, let's move on down the East Coast into our delay. Delay has a mix control, so you can't only hear the wet signal, it just mixes in the delay effect. A bit of noise in the background, I don't know if you can hear it, not that bad. And yeah, it has this sort of tape echo style modulation as you change it. And yeah, feedback doesn't self-oscillate, so it will die down. Eventually, delay times are up to a second. And it can be tempo synced to, like I said, either MIDI, tap tempo, or external clock. Let's take a slightly deeper look at the envelopes. Simple ADSR, as you'd expect. Velocity controls are nice. So all the way down, velocity has no impact. As you increase this, then it becomes more sensitive to velocity. Light touch. And same goes for the modulation envelope. No velocity impact, and with velocity impact. So the harder I press, the deeper the modulation. And if I press lightly, there's no modulation. If you hit drone on the envelope, the note will drone at the sustain level. And this acts kind of like a gate, so if I release it, it'll die down with release. And I already mentioned you can loop the mod envelope. You do need to press a key for the looping to start, for the mod envelope to start. And it loops nicely well into audio rates. That's pretty much what you need to know about the panel. Before we head out to the patch ideas section, a few miscellaneous items. First, MIDI. There's one hidden function actually on IMPLEXUS. If you want to select the MIDI channel it listens to, you need to hold tap tempo when you power it up and then select channel 1 through 10 using these buttons. Mod wheel CC1 is directly linked into the wave folder. And then one more thing about MIDI that I found a bit odd, it only accepts notes within a 4-octave range from note 36 to 84. Now you can play more than a 4-octave range by transposing the oscillators using the range knob. But it will still only listen to a 4-octave range on the keyboard, which I just found a bit odd. So if I transpose this 1 octave down, it'll still listen, but then going further an octave down, it stops listening, which most synths do. And this way, say, if I have this transposed up, this is the lowest note I can play. I asked the company about this. It's a hardware limitation, so it is what it is. And then one final little MIDI complaint. It takes a while for the clock to catch up with external MIDI clock, even if you're playing at the same tempo. So as I hit play here with the delay, you can hear the delay modulating around as the clock attempts to sync. Then if I hit stop and play again, it'll happen again. A way I found around this is to start playing with the delay all the way down and then bring it in a bit later when sync found its place. Other miscellaneous items, there's a handy dandy tuner, so you don't need to start a show like this. You can keep the oscillators silent, tune the complex oscillator and the basic one. The LEDs show you if you're flat or sharp. So they should now be magically in tune. Let's check it out. 445 ain't that far from 440. And fine tune goes, by the way, about a half octave up and half octave down, and you can obviously always tune manually. This just lets you tune to A. Then finally, for our miscellaneous section, there's a pitch envelope amount, global for both oscillators, both generators, and then an overall glide. Though there's no legato portamento, so it'll glide regardless of whether you play legato or not. Okay, let's take a closer look at the patch bay, the real one, of course, and a few ideas that go with it. One of the things that immediately jumped at me when I first saw the patch bay is that it has separate CV inputs for each of the oscillators or generators. This means that this synth can be played paraphonically via CV, either in drone mode or with one of the notes keeping the gate open. In this case, drone mode it is, and a keyboard split on the KeyStep Pro. Each split sends out CV through a different output. Those are the white cables you see coming out of the KeyStep in the back and being fed into IMPLEXUS. You could use a keyboard like the KeyStep Pro, sequencer like the SQ64, or any other modular sequencer. The two notes would share the same filter articulation, and each note would sound different because of the different timbral characteristics of each generator or oscillator, but still I think it's a fun way to play IMPLEXUS. The conclusion of this will be on my Patreon. Let's move on. By the way, if you're curious, I asked Majella if playing duophonically via MIDI would be possible in a firmware update, and they said it wouldn't because it would require another physical DAC that doesn't exist in the synth. Next patch idea is to solve my complaint about this not having filter tracking. So if you turn down the filter, it won't track as you play up and down the keyboard, which means higher notes will just get drowned out if the filter cutoff is set too low. You can't play the filter via MIDI, but if you have a keyboard like the KeyStep or KeyStep Pro or SQ64 or any other MIDI/CV capable controller, then you can hook into the pitch CV out and connect that to the filter cutoff. And I should have brought a longer cable, but let's ignore that for now. Now our filter will move as we play up and down the keyboard, and notes will remain bright regardless of where we play them. If you still miss modulating the filter in other ways, you can do it with patch cables. If you've got an external attenuator or even attenuverter, it could come in handy. If not, let's see the difference between having one and not. I'll go from LFO2 into cutoff. So without an attenuator, LFO2 into the filter, you're going to get pretty extreme modulation, which is cool. Now, if we wanted to somehow moderate this, and we didn't have an external attenuator, we could go into velocity instead. So now LFO2 is getting sent to velocity across the synth, but we could moderate its impact wherever we wanted, as long as we had envelope control. And if these LFO rates weren't fast enough for us, we could go from the basic oscillator at audio rates into velocity. So at high rates, what happens is anyone's guess. Get into Foreman style sounds. Let's add it to the wave folder too. Why not? The manual comes with a few interesting patch ideas. You're hearing variations based on some of them here. What's going on is clock is plugged into gate and the LFO into pitch. And a similar idea here, clock plugged into gate, get the rhythm going, and LFO2 plugged into the filter cutoff. And it's set to random or sample and hold, which gives the patch randomness. Let's take this opportunity to listen to a few of IMPLEXUS's timbres. And again, I'll post a conclusion, the other half of this jam on Patreon. Let's move on. So that was clock controlling different elements of the synth. Let's now go the other way around, take an LFO and plug that into clock. The idea is to drive the clock nuts by feeding a random LFO into it. As the LFO jumps between voltage levels, not all of these levels will trigger the clock, some will and some won't. The interesting thing about this is that it impacts all the rhythmic aspects of this patch, meaning the two LFOs, not just the delay. You could do the same thing probably with the gate as you play the keyboard. So now clock will adjust to the speed I play. If I play slower, the slower the clock, and if I play faster, you'll hear the delay try to catch up. You can do this with any synth that syncs to external clock. Any LFOs that are set to sync will also follow this rhythm. Okay, so that was an overview of IMPLEXUS. Let's talk about some pros and cons. On the pros side, probably the most interesting thing is, I think, IMPLEXUS's focus and sound, which is a matter of taste, of course, but I think it's great. It starts with a good, solid bass and remains interesting across the frequency spectrum with plenty of wave-folding timbres in between. Whereas most monosynths focus on subtractive or East Coast synthesis, IMPLEXUS devotes a lot of panel real estate for various wave-folding, bias, audio rate cross-mod options for these parameters with these LED rings that just invite you to crush and fold waveforms as opposed to just filter them. IMPLEXUS also has a distinct focus on rhythmic patching with these various time division sync buttons that just invite you to explore the interplay of rhythmic LFOs with time-synced delays. And even though the filter didn't get its own LED ring, it still has a nice sound, I think, with that bit of Roland sparkle to it. So you can always take a break from the West Coast if you like. So on the sonic and modulation side, IMPLEXUS gets 2 thumbs up. For me, it's certainly unique and different. Then on the interface, it's knob per function taken to the extreme, which is both a good thing and a bad thing. It's good because there are no shift functions to remember, and it's very clear what each knob and switch does, but you do miss out on an additional layer of functionality that some synths get when they introduce a shift key. What those extra functions could have been is up to anyone's personal preference, and obviously it would have cost more to add anything to this. So whether the lack of additional functions can be considered a con or really up to you. I mentioned some things that I felt were missing throughout this video. For example, the small MIDI input range, lack of filter tracking, lack of paraphonic control via MIDI, which I guess could have been added, but an extra cost. Which brings me to the main con of this synth, which is the price. You're basically paying a premium for the fact that this is an analog synth with a very premium build made by a small boutique company. Not that that's a bad thing. I'm partial to small companies myself, but there are some alternatives you might want to consider at a lower cost. Obviously, there's nothing that does exactly what this does, but if you're willing to settle for slightly fewer wavefolding options, there are other synths that have both wavefolding and rhythmic LFOs, albeit without dedicated division buttons. I'm sure there are plenty of examples. If you want to go the analog route, the Arturia Mini Brute 2 and 2S immediately come to mind. They also have a sequencer and arpeggiator. Wavefolding is almost an afterthought there, but it is there with perhaps a slightly less polished design. If you're willing to go for digital synths, the range of options expands considerably. For example, the Hydrasynth or Anima Phi, which I just reviewed, and that's just to name a few that cost less and have a longer feature list, obviously more complex and not knob per function. Aside from that, another complaint that I can think of is the patch bay being in the back. To be honest, IMPLEXUS could have been totally fine without the patch bay at all, but since it's there and it's in the back, now I have a reason to complain that it's not as easily accessible as if it were on the panel. A slightly smaller logo and a front panel patch bay would have been preferred in my opinion, but obviously that's a conscious design choice. So to summarize, it's a great sounding analog synth with fun rhythmic options and excellent build, but relatively speaking, it comes at a cost. Another thing that comes at a cost, though much lower, is my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks, not to mention extended jams and other downloads available to the good people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful, ring the bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.